Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
All right, let's get started. Hello, my name is Rich Stokely. Welcome to the MSR Visiting Speaker Series. When Amy Draves asked me if I'd be willing to roast Scott today, I told her I'd be more than happy to. She then went out of her way to explain this was not a roast of Scott and that I needed to give a proper intro. I also know Scott has an hour and a half to make fun of me after I speak, so on with the proper intro. Scott graduated from Carnegie Mellon. He studied computer science and philosophy. He then came to Microsoft, where he was here almost 10 years, spent a lot of that time on Internet Explorer. 1 through 5. So if you have any back button questions or problems, he's the guy to send mail to. After his time at Microsoft, he did something very unusual, something I think a lot of us don't really have the guts to do, which is he left a great job and a lot of great people behind, and he went out and pursued an untested passion, in his case, writing. 10 years later, he is a best-selling author. He has 4 works leading up to The Year Without Pants. He also regularly contributes to national newspapers and has been an expert on a number of news programs, including NPR, CNN, MSNBC, and the like. What I always loved about Scott's writing is his style is quite casual, but he always focuses on things that are actionable. So not only is his writing entertaining, but don't tell him this, it's also pretty useful. So I encourage you to go back and look at his previous works. They're great. That brings us up to The Year Without Pants. I had an opportunity to read the first draft, and it was awful. But it gives me an opportunity to talk about one of Scott's superpowers. Scott, and you have just one superpower, in a kind of relentless pursuit of the truth and understanding, Scott has a miraculous capability to quash his preconceptions, his biases, and most importantly, his ego in pursuit of really understanding a project. It's a very rare gift. And with that, I consider Scott a trusted source on the topics he chooses to write about. And after the volumes of negative criticism we gave him, I'm confident that The Year Without Pants will be another bestseller for Scott. So please join me in welcoming Scott Birkin.
Hi. Hi. How you doing? Welcome. It's good to be back here. I haven't been back here in a while, as Stokely mentioned. And this book is unusual. And what I'm going to do is tell a story about the book. The book is a large story. It's called The Year Without Pants for a reason. The word year doesn't appear in many business books because a lot of authors write about subjects that they haven't experienced firsthand in a very long time. And as Mr. Stokely, my friend, mentioned, I've been on my own as a writer for about 10 years. So I've been one of these people that you guys see and invite into events, and maybe your groups hire as consultants to come in and be experts and give expert opinions. And I remember when I was a manager working on Internet Explorer, I would often see these people who are experts come in, and the question in the back of my mind was, wait a second, when was the last time this person had actually done the thing that they're giving advice about? Was that a month ago, a year ago, 10 years ago? Why is it that all their stories are from other people's companies? Why aren't any of their stories from the first person? And I had this feeling as I've become an author. I've written 4 books. Most of them have been popular. They're largely about ideas and working with ideas, creative thinking, managing innovation, how to persuade and pitch people on ideas. These are all things that, in the larger sense, are about work. And as my career as a writer has gone on, I realized slowly I was becoming one of these people that gets invited to speak to large groups as the expert and gets all this attention for opinions. But these are on things I have not done or had not done in a long time. And my own sense of my integrity was waning. And I knew at some point I needed to go back to work on a real project at a real company with real commitments where I couldn't just give advice and take some money and walk away, and to find out how much of my own advice did I actually practice. So that's the story behind The Year Without Pants. I had the opportunity, because of the books themselves, Matt Mullenweg, who's the founder of WordPress. How many of you know WordPress? You've heard of WordPress. Maybe you use it. Microsoft's blogging platform got transitioned over to WordPress. WordPress inherited many Microsoft created blogs, so they thank you for that. They're very happy about that. But I came to know Matt Mullenweg, the founder, through one of my books, and he had me come in and do some consulting for them. And then once his company got large enough that they wanted to become a little bit more normal, I'll explain why they're abnormal in a second. They wanted to become a little bit more normal and actually form teams for the first time. He reached out to me and said, Scott, would you like to come and work at WordPress.com and manage a team? And in that moment that he asked me, given this thing that was on the back of my mind, this notion I had about going back to work, when he made that offer to me, I had two completely polar opposite responses. It was awesome and horrible. It was all horrible. It was a combination of those things. It was fantastic. I use WordPress. It's a popular product. It's a popular thing in the world. You don't get that many opportunities to work on things that are popular and that you use, that maybe happens once or twice in a career. But at the same time, it was terrifying to me because I knew I've written all these books, given all these advice and all these lectures. I don't remember half of what I say anyway. I certainly changed my mind enough time. How am I going to actually go back to work and try to apply all the stuff that I had learned? But I decided that this was exactly the kind of book that I wish someone else would write. And since I don't know of anyone else who's done a book like this, as a writer, I realized I was obligated to go and give it a try. So that's the story behind The Year Without Pants. And I'm going to spend about 20 minutes, 25 minutes telling you parts of that story and explaining to you why I think parts of the story are related to the future of work that will affect everyone. I'll also explain why parts of the story are ridiculous and absurd, and I don't recommend anyone even emulate or attempt at home, even if you're wearing a crash helmet and a bulletproof vest. And then we'll open the floor for questions. Since this is a unique opportunity, at least for me, I used to be employed in the same place that you guys are now. The kind of conversation we can have about the contrast between this very different place and the place you are is a unique opportunity. I want to spend as much time doing Q&A as possible. Does that make sense? Seem like a good plan for the next hour? You don't have a choice. So be enthusiastic and have faith. One complaint I have about most books about the future of work, or the future of anything really, is how completely oblivious they are to all the other books that attempt to predict the future and how horrible a job they do. We are horrible at prediction. We are awful. Even the people who are professional predictors are awful. And you can't do a good job at talking about the future of something, I believe, unless you've spent a little bit of time thinking about the history of stuff. Because that gives you a sense of, well, what did they predict then and what happened, and what did they predict the following decade and what happened, and you have some basis for getting better at making predictions. So the reason why there's a picture of a cave painting up here is one of the questions I had about work and how most people are not really that happy in the workplace. I'll talk a little bit more about why I believe that to be true and some data to support it, but let's assume for a second most modern knowledge workers are not that happy. They're not completely happy in their workplace. They don't find a lot of meaning in their work. If you go back to the first work, the oldest kind of work there is, the furthest back you can go in terms of the history of work, work meant working to survive. You had to work to find food and shelter every day. That's the first work we have. You can't go before that. And that work was incredibly meaningful. That was, if you didn't do that work or you didn't do it well, you died. There's no greater, higher meaning than work could possibly have. And then if you follow the progression of work and what we call work, moving from agricultural to industrial, and then now to our knowledge age, and you look at that those transitions, as proud as we are, we believe that's a kind of progress, meaning has declined. The amount of meaning people get from their work has declined. So it's an interesting question that's underneath all of my experiences at WordPress that I poke at in the book periodically. I step back to poke at to go, what does this mean? Is this a way to make things better, to give us more meaning out of our work experiences? Or is it just another technology, another fad, another trend that doesn't really help us progress in some of these things that are actually most important to us? So a quick note about WordPress. You all raised your hands that you're familiar with it. But since WordPress itself is an open source project, they do no marketing. There's no marketing team. There's no television advertisements. It's all completely customer-led evangelism about the product itself. WordPress powers about 70 million websites. That's 1 out of every 5. 20% of the web runs on WordPress, which is an astounding number. That's a ridiculous number. It doesn't get enough attention because there's no marketing team behind pushing that number in your face all the time, and that number has been growing. WordPress.com, which is where I worked, which is the place you can go to actually get a blog that's not only free, the software is not only free, but the hosting is free too, gets about 4 billion page views a month. Last week, WordPress.com passed Yahoo to be the number 8th most trafficked website in the United States. This is number 8. This is serious stuff. This is not a jokey startup that does funky, weird things because no one cares what they make. This is a real serious thing that affects the future of not just the web, but the internet and the internet industries themselves, just because of the scale and the popularity of how it works. Specific to the culture there and the culture shock that I experienced. So I've told you, I worked for about a decade at Microsoft. You guys know what that is like. I then spent a decade working mostly on my own as a writer. You can imagine what that is like. A lot of talking to my dog, a lot of abuse of alcohol and other stimulant substances. You can imagine what that's like. What you probably can't imagine, because I couldn't imagine, is working in an environment that has all these really unusual characteristics. Maybe these are things that are coming for all of us, maybe not. The first is no one uses email. No one uses email. Half of you in this room are probably thinking about what's in your inbox right now. Or you're thinking about email you want to send. And certainly the people who are watching at home, I'm sure I'm only getting their ears and their eyes are glued to their inboxes and sending email and distribution lists and whatnot. They don't use email. I'll talk more about how they get away with that in a second. But as the core ways people communicate, email is not part of that. Second, everyone works remotely. So this is the thing that many people know about WordPress.com. And Automatic is actually the corporation that runs WordPress.com. So forgive me if I switch those two names periodically, Automatic and WordPress.com. One of the reasons the book is called The Year Without Pants is a reference to the fact that everyone works remotely. So the team that I led and managed, one guy worked in Ireland, another guy was from Australia, another guy lived in LA. And as the course of the year went on, my team got bigger and I had employees that were living in Europe that I never saw. The entire company, 100% is remote. There are very few rules. There's this very strong emphasis on autonomy. So you, once you're hired, are given a great deal of control about what you work on, how you do it, what tools you use. These are all things that are common at most young startups. But WordPress.com started in 2005. They've been doing all this stuff for a long time. The list goes on. And I probably can't even cover all the astounding things that they do there. The book documents my year going through all of them and how I dealt with the culture shock of trying to overcome them. Open vacation policy. What I want to focus on instead are these 3 things. There's big questions. I'll talk specifically about how daily work worked at WordPress.com, which I'm sure is something you're curious about. And then I'll leave you with some thoughts about why I think you should care. So I alluded in my opening preamble or intro about statistics. A lot of studies are not worth their headlines. I think you guys probably know this. You guys are all smart. The claims that journalists or bloggers make based on the data in most studies is pretty sloppy. And I'm a critic of most studies that I read. One study that was published recently that I like, that I think is telling about the state of the workplace, is this poll from Gallup that was done this year. And the poll was about the American workplace and engagement. So the primary statistic and evaluative method they used was people self-reporting about how engaged they were at work. 70% of all the respondents responded that they were not engaged at work. That's almost 75%, 3 out of 4. Not engaged. And of that number, half of them were actively disengaged at work. Actively disengaged should terrify you. Think about having an actively disengaged brain surgeon. Actively disengaged, I mean, they're not even faking it. They're not even faking. They're playing solitaire, Angry Birds, and they're scalpeling at your head. They're actively disengaged. That's half of that number. The other half is just not interested. So not engaged, but not actively disengaged, which is really not that good either. And what does this mean? Well, this is where people get into trouble with studies. What does it mean? It's hard to know exactly what this means. I think part of what it means is a failure of management. I've had in my career before, I was fortunate enough to come to Microsoft while I was in college and high school. I had a lot of really crappy jobs. I worked as a waiter, I did telemarketing, I did direct mail. Some of those jobs I was fully engaged in because of the people I worked with or the people I worked for or certain elements that were created in the environment I was doing those things. So I look at this number as an indictment of anyone in a leadership or management role. It means there's something about how the work has been structured, the culture that's been created, that allows people to feel most comfortable not being engaged. That's the only way they can maintain their dignity or their self-respect. Something personal about meaning is missing, so they keep themselves out. The book doesn't spend a whole lot of time talking about the history of work. It's something I've studied because I don't feel like I can write about stuff well unless I know the backstory. And there's a lot of arguments about how the Industrial Revolution is transformed into the knowledge age and whether we're still being victimized now by Taylor and this notion that workers are changeable, interchangeable, despite all the rhetoric we have of being creative and innovative and trying new things and experimental attitudes and cultures and agile teams and all that rhetoric. Many managers and executives manage their organizations in Tayloristic ways. That they see individuals and developers and designers and even program managers as cogs and widgets that can just be replaced and swapped around. So there's still this model of built into our cultures, our management cultures. It's very old, very old. There's this anecdote that I think is interesting that most people don't think about, that the birth of management as a discipline, as a profession, came from the industrial age. It came from the need to manage large banks and railroad train schedules. These were the huge growth industries in the 1850s, 60s, and 70s. And those were the people, the robber barons of that age, those were the people who started the first business schools. You can go and look it up. There's a direct correlation between the philosophies behind those business schools and the notion of what management even is, and the Vanderbilts and the Rockefellers, etc. There's certainly exceptions to that. I haven't looked up the founding members of every business school in America, but this is true for many of the prominent ones. And that's reflected in the culture that's inherently built in to how management as a discipline is thought about. Centered on command and control with workers and individuals in the culture, just being cogs in the wheel, things that are replaceable. And that the most important person in a corporation, the creative force, the genius force, is the executive, is the manager. And everything else is satellites around what they do. Another fact to offer you, this is probably the last statistic I will offer you, is just about remote work, because I get asked this all the time regarding the book, as people go, you know, a whole completely remote company? Like, that's kind of ridiculous. It's kind of extreme. What's actually going on? Is everyone going to work remotely? The data on this is pretty clear that the numbers are going up. Currently across the planet, in terms of the professional workforce, about 20% of people work remotely. That's 1 in 5 across the planet. In companies or companies that are open to technologies, it's much higher than this. Certainly companies that are permissive about allowing workers to telecommute or work remotely part of the time. There's a narrow definition that we use for remote work, and I think that's part of the problem. If ever you or any of your parents or grandparents ever had a conversation with a coworker on a telephone, guess what you were doing? You were doing remote work. When you're on Facebook with a family member who's miles away, you haven't seen them in a year, but you still consider that a relationship, that is a remote friendship. We do lots of things remotely, and the basis of a company working that way, although I was never an advocate or a zealot about that being a preferred way, the potentials or possibilities of that, we know remote activities have been part of our lives for a long time and are a growing part of how we do all kinds of interactions in our lives. So the book itself, before I even worked there, I came up with a list of questions I wanted to answer. That the goal of the book is to go and use my own story, my own guinea pig experience, going back to work at a real job to answer. The first one I mentioned already, which was kind of personal, about how much of my own advice do I practice. Stuff that I preach, do I actually do any of these things? If you're familiar with any of my other books, then maybe that's of interest to you. If you've never heard of me before, you probably don't care at all, which is fine. The other questions, though, are much more interesting. What are the work conventions that we accept as status quo and almost required in any job that serve no purpose? What are they? Which ones can be stripped away because they're just they're artifice? They're things that just we've collected over time and forget to question anymore. 9 to 5 working hours. Try to find a study that supports the claim that 9 to 5 working hours make people more productive. Or that wearing a tie makes you smarter. Or a dress. You won't find any. These are artifacts of culture. We inherited these things long ago for reasons we don't even know anymore. And then once we get hired into these cultures, we adopt the same assumptions about those things, and then we defend them and protect them. Questions about hierarchy, meetings, status reports, all these things that we assume to be true. I wanted to go into an environment that didn't have any of these things and report firsthand, hey, do we need that? Can I function as a manager without being able to see my teammates every day? Without being the decision-making authority focused on me as a manager all the time? And of course, this larger question about remote work and location. So the picture you see here is a month after I was hired. This is my team. And it looks like an ordinary, I don't know, it could be anything. It could be 3 college students on vacation who don't like each other very much, so they're spending their time on Facebook or something. Who knows? You can't really tell from this what's really going on. You can't even really tell where they are. So it turns out that this photo was taken in Athens, Greece, in our hotel lobby while we were doing project work. The laptop in front is actually mine. I took a step away to take the photo. And this is what our work life looked like, the limited number of times that we actually worked in the same room together. So on the left is Mike Adams, and he actually is a main character in the book because he was one of my primary developers. In the middle is Adam Peatling, who is from England and Ireland, and that's Bo Lebbins on the right, who's from Australia. In the course of managing the team for a year and a half, I met face-to-face with these people maybe 6 or 7 times. The reason why we're in Athens, Greece is an interesting story on its own. When it came time for us to decide if we wanted to meet together for the first time, face-to-face, which was something the company supported, when teams were new, I was hired to be one of the first team managers, we were told that we could, if we wanted to, if we thought it was important, meet together in the same physical space a few times a year. There was no policy written down. It was just, I don't know, let's see if it matters. So we were one of the first teams to do this. We asked Matt Mullenweg, my boss and the company founder, where we should go. And he said, Athens is good this time of year. So I said, great. And I filled out the right expense reports to make it happen before he changed his mind. There is actually a logical reason behind it. It wasn't that self-indulgent. Because Peatling was from Ireland and Bo's from Australia, we had flexibility as to where the most logical place to go that would be for us all to meet. The question that I had personally in all of this as a manager in a company that never had management before, this is one of the central questions of the book, being brought into a company with the experience I had as a program manager at Microsoft in a place that doesn't know what a manager really is, doesn't have schedules for things, doesn't really have any organized systems for doing many of the things that you guys probably believe are impossible to succeed without. The question I had was, how do you introduce the notion of teams and structure into a young, non-corporate culture that thrives on chaos? This is a terrifying question. I mean, this is a question you can ask yourself about whatever your role is. How could you function if you had to go into an environment that knew nothing of the assumptions and the foundations that you base your work on? So in the first few weeks I was at the company, I was trying to figure out an answer to this question. I needed an answer. I thought about methodologies. I thought about processes. I couldn't find another book where someone was crazy enough to do something like this. So I came up with the only answer that made sense to me, which was these 2 things: clarity and trust. I know it's not much. Clarity and trust. The conclusion that I reached was, this is a hypothesis, it was not a conclusion. One of the hypotheses I had is that I'd last there a month, everyone realized this was a bad idea, and I'd get fired. In fact, in the conversation I had with Mullenweg, the founder of the company, about the whole prospect of this, I told him that. I'm like, this could be a real big disaster, because I could totally get in the way and screw everything up. I mean, I did that a few times while I was at Microsoft, where it was built to have program managers. And I told him that. He's like, yeah, I know. He liked the prospect of trying something different just to see what would happen. And obviously I did too, because I was willing to take the job and write the book about it. But clarity and trust were the things I came down to. I felt like if I could earn the trust of these guys, these people, independent of how little they knew about me, if I could find ways to earn their trust, and then I could provide clarity around how to be smarter, or how to make a better decision, or how to come up with a better plan, or how to make their work as programmers and designers more valuable. If I could be the source of clarity, then I would naturally emerge, even in the chaos, as a leader in the group. That was my theory. And the book follows the story of me trying different things and failing and experimenting with different ways to try to achieve that. The question most people want to know, and I have just a few minutes left before we'll open for Q&A, is just daily work. How do you function when everyone's remote, which means we're all in different time zones, there's no email? How do you even get anything done? And the answer are these three things. This is how 90% of the communication inside Automatic is done. IRC, Skype, and something called P2. P2 is just it's a kind of WordPress blog. It's a theme. It's a freely available theme. If you get bored, you can do a Google or Bing search. Almost got in trouble there. For a few laughs in the front. You can do a search for WordPress P2 theme, and you can read all about it. IRC is just Internet Relay Chat. It's this old, ancient, creaky chat program from like 1988. It's really, really old. But the open source community has embraced it and uses it. So most open source projects in the world probably have a bunch of people that communicate through IRC. So at Automatic, they had a private IRC chat system. So you could have chat rooms, and that's the hallway. That is the equivalent of your hallway. The only requirement wasn't even a requirement. It was sort of a cultural imperative. Whenever you're working from wherever in the world you are, and again, you could be anywhere. You could be on a Jeep in Africa, chasing tigers or whatever. As long as it had good Wi-Fi and you're still answering questions and stuff, no one cares. They may not even know where you are. Anyway, as long as you're working, wherever you are, in the Jeep, on an airplane, whatever, you have to be in IRC, because it's the hallway. So that's where you go when you have a question you can't figure out, when you're looking for advice on something, you want someone to review your spec, although they didn't really have specs, or review your code or your design. That's where you go. And it was informal, just like your hallway is. And you run into people you know better, some you don't know as well. That's where any of that serendipity or just random communication would take place. That's the hallway. Skype, which you should all be familiar with, Skype is the lifeblood of most other communication. So if ever I wanted to have a one-on-one chat with someone who was on my team or someone else in the company, they were working on something and I needed to give them feedback on it, or I had a decision to make, or we needed to do a meeting, that's what Skype was for. Skype had an interesting political challenge in the organization, because one of the benefits of IRC is that it's logged. This will sound really scary and terrifying, but all communication there is logged and public to the company. So if I had an argument or a debate with a coworker in the hallway in IRC, and a week goes by and people go, Scott, why'd you make that decision? I go, I don't know. Someone could go and search and see what exactly I said as my argument for that thing. And that's seen as an asset. You don't have to archive it in email. You don't have to dig through your email archive to figure out where was that message. Instead, it's just there. And there's a search engine on it. You can search it. So anyway, Skype has become increasingly popular at the company. It's used for one-on-one communication. It is private and secure. So all of my dealings with my team that were more of a personal nature about their performance or giving them feedback that's probably not appropriate to be broadcast to all their coworkers, that's what Skype was for. And on the day that I convinced my team to have a team meeting, a weekly team meeting, let me say that sentence again. I had to convince my team to have a weekly meeting. This was like a breakthrough for me. When that happened, we did it in Skype. And 6 months after doing that, I managed to convince the team, or we agreed together. Wasn't so focused on me. After 6 months, we agreed to do it with voice. This was the breakthrough moment. Actually hear each other's voices. P2 on the right is technologically the least interesting of these three. It's just a blog. The theme is set up so it's a little bit more like Twitter. You don't have to log in. There's no posting, editing box. You just go to the screen and whatever thing you have, whatever document or decision or thing you want feedback on, you post it. And like all blogs are good for, someone posts something and then there's a comment discussion thread underneath it. All of our work, all the documents that you send around perhaps in email for asking for feedback or whatever, that's all managed through the blogs. And it's not a surprise that WordPress.com is heavily dependent on blogs to do communication. It's the lifeblood of the company. So something like 95% of all communication I had inside the company was through these three things. Most of the email I sent or received was people outside the company. Occasionally there'd be uses for it that it was just the most effective tool, and we would use it. There was never a decree. About a year and a half ago, there was a CEO of a company, I forget the name of the company, that decreed no one would use email for like 3 months. And he did it. I don't remember what the outcome was, but he decreed it. This was not a culture where there were decrees for anything. Instead, it was up to us as a team and individuals on the team to decide for ourselves what we thought the tools that were best to get our work done. So there's never any philosophical debate about which tools we used or how much we use one tool or another. This is actually, if you the P2 I mentioned is a publicly available theme. You can go and play with it and use it on any WordPress blog. And it's a lot like Basecamp, if ever you've seen or used Basecamp or something like it, where it's built for workflow without a lot of the overhead and all the advantages of blogs where you can search it and archive it, etc. So the last thing I want to leave you with about why you should care, I think that you can look at the book, and in Q&A this will come out too, as a journey of taking this large inventory of management and leadership methods, many of which I accumulated here at Microsoft, that I wore out in that tool belt. I used them well to be an effective program manager and manager of program managers. Taking this toolkit and then going to an environment that is completely a generation or two ahead, at least in attitude and toolkit, and finding out how much of that stuff works. And what does someone like me, who's supposed to be an expert at all this stuff, what of that toolkit ended up being useful? Which things did I throw away? I look at these numbers and I think that all corporations, certainly all knowledge-based workplaces are facing these two trends, that employee engagement generally is down. This 70% number from the Gallup poll should be terrifying to anyone who organizes or leads a group of people. That's a terrifying number. 1 out of 4 of your people are actually engaged. And you guys can think for yourself how engaged you are. I mean, you can't be that engaged if you came to a lecture at 1 o'clock, right? So there's something else you're looking for, you're hoping to get. The bottom number, of course, is about this remote thing. And some companies, Yahoo's come up in this, about having this really strong opinion about, oh, it's bad. And that's a complete failing of this distinction between process and traditions and results. And one of the questions that comes up in the book again and again, and all these experiences that I faced, including things I thought were stupid or bad or broken, but this forcing of evaluating, am I rejecting this because of tradition, because of my own philosophy, or am I rejecting this because of the results? And in the face of remote work, this is just one simple example, or email is another. Why wouldn't you let an employee try these things? Why wouldn't you, provided you tell them your performance has to be just as good or better? If you can tell an employee that, hey, go work remotely, but your number of check code check-ins or the number of specs you write or whatever you're being evaluated on has to be just as good, you are inspiring them to find a way to make it work. And if they come back and make it work and they've achieved the same performance, you lose nothing. And you probably gain their trust, which is the key word, as I mentioned, I think, to being successful. You gain their trust because you're willing to let them go and prove something to you. And if they come back and fail and don't meet the results, you still win because you showed you were open to try. And so many of the workplaces I visit as one of these author or expert guys seem so locked down and so unwilling to even experiment or try anything on these traditions. And that's really the larger question that I hope the book and the stories from the book raise. I'm not a zealot advocating everyone should copy what they do, but the questions that they ask and the way they go about trying to find answers, I think, is inspiring and informative to most of the working world. So with that, I will thank you for listening, and we'll open the floor for questions. Yes, sir. I'm supposed to repeat the question, I assume, right? Yes. Okay, good.
Curious what the backstory of why they wanted to bring in teams and some sort of management. What was the driving force behind it?
So the question was, what's the backstory on why they wanted teams at all? And I am culpable in the story. They had two things going on. The company was growing. As WordPress.com grew, the company itself was growing. They reached about 40 or 50 people. And Matt Mullenweg and Tony Schneider, the CEO of the company, realized that they were starting to have some problems and just staying coordinated. Even as much as they loved chaos, even they were admitting that there were problems. So they asked me to come in as a consultant, and I spent some time with them, and I gave them what seems like an elementary consultancy kind of suggestion. How about teams? And they thought it over, and they thought, yeah, I'm sure they had thought of it too, but to hear it from an expert gives it a certain, you guys all know this, part of what experts get paid for is so people can go, hey, it's not just me saying this, expert guy who I happen to have paid a lot of money, what a surprise, he's saying the same thing I'm saying. That's a lot of how marketing, how consultants and experts make a living. It shouldn't be a surprise. Anyway, I was that guy, I offered that to them, and then about 4 or 5 months later, that's when Matt Mullenweg said, hey, we're doing this. Why don't you be one of the team leaders? And just like I mentioned before, I had one of these excited, terrified moments. I had it again because it's terrifying as an advisor to go and be the tool by which your advice is carried out. If it goes wrong, you're doubly to blame. Anyway, so that's the story. Yes?
When did you start having the feeling that you needed meetings, and how often did you have them?
When did I start feeling like we needed meetings, and how often did we have them? I thought going in that it would be an inevitable consequence of calling something a team. Because by nature of calling something a team, it means you're doing stuff together. If you're doing stuff together, it probably means you should talk about what you're doing. Having a set time when you make sure that happens just seemed logical. So we met once a week. That was the basic unit. I'm a fan of calendars. Many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with all the different software development methodologies. I'm familiar with many of them too. I just like the calendar methodology. How do we know what we do today is good? How are we going to be sure this week's work is good? How are we going to be sure at the end of the month we have something to show? Some agile methods are more calendar-based. Anyway, I don't like to use any of that vocabulary. I thought it'd be a bad idea to use that vocabulary there, so it's just a week. And eventually we got more sophisticated, and we would talk about the most important assignment people had for the week. Most important thing by Friday. And since the WordPress.com is a service, it was rare that we had large schedules to manage or delivery dates. One chapter in the book follows the story of Jetpack, which is one of the major projects we worked on. It's a very important plugin. There's a lot of sophisticated cloud stuff. It's actually very important strategically to WordPress. But it required a specific launch date. So that was a real challenge, and it's maybe the most interesting chapter in the book for you guys, because I had this toolkit of all the big projects I'd worked on at Microsoft, Windows and whatnot, 2-year schedules and all the dependency trees, and tried to figure out how much of that to use and how to fit it into this culture that had no experience with that before. So it was probably a month into being on the team that we started having meetings once a week, and then whenever we needed to, we would have more frequent meetings. Yes?
You said everybody could choose what they could work on.
Yes.
Right? So how did it work? What were you managing? Were you managing how people lived up to their commitments? Or how did you review their performance?
Okay. So the question was, how did people pick what they worked on, and what was my role as a manager or as a leader? So at the time I was hired, the answers to these questions changed. So all 3 of those people who I showed, they were all interested in this team idea. They wanted to work on things that were bigger than what they could do on their own. Even though all three of them were very good programmers, they all realized inherently they wanted to work on stuff that was bigger than what they could do themselves. So they were more open to having a little bit less choice about what they worked on. Had you done a book about the company 6 months before I got there, the answer to that question probably would have been very different. Built into, it's hard to imagine. I remember my experiences working here, because there's so little structure. There's not a 5-level, 8-level structure where there's all this reporting about personal goals and 6-month goals and mid-year reviews. There's none of that. It's completely informal. So there's no, it's hard to explain this just in Q&A how different the culture was around a lot of these things. And the best answer I can give you is an anecdote, and it's in the book. The first time I met them, the company has a meeting once a year where everyone's there. Once a year, everyone's there. They do believe it's important for people to get all the intangibles together. It happens once a year. And at that meeting, which was the first time I met them, we had our first at a dinner table, talking about how we wanted to work together. And the meeting went fine. They were open to me being the leader and at least giving it a shot, this experiment. Before it ended, I asked them a question. And it had been a question been on my mind since the day I was hired. The question I asked them was, how do you know if you're doing a good job? I said it to all three of them. How do you know if you're doing a good job? Because I'm thinking, not even just Microsoft, most companies have a performance system that's all this about promotions, And I knew that, as far as I know, WordPress.com had none of that. So I asked all three that question, and all three of them looked at each other and go, I don't know. I don't know. And it was the kind of I don't know of like, not only why are you asking me this question, like how does that factor into what we're doing here? The explanation for the answer is that the culture of WordPress comes from the open source project, which is volunteer-based. When you have any sort of roots in your whatever thing you're doing that's volunteer-based, it's sort of built in to the way people treat each other that anyone can walk away. It's just sort of an attitude about how people treat each other. There's a lot of positives to that. There are some negatives, and the book talks about those too, but there's a lot of positives to that where people are doing the work because it's meaningful to them. The work itself, not the carrot in front of it. They were excited to be working on the features we worked on. They were excited to be able to make WordPress better for whatever reason. Some of their motivations were purely selfish. They just liked the technology. They liked the intellectual challenge of it. For some of them, the motivation was more empowerment, which I'm sure for some of you is true. Because when you work at Microsoft, you work on projects that you have the rare opportunity to make things that millions of people will use. But those are intrinsic meanings. It's not about the structure or how I was going to evaluate them or what the scorecard was going to say at the end of the year. They had no familiarity with those things, but they didn't understand why you'd even need them, which I think is fascinating. Will that still be true 10 years from now at WordPress.com? I don't know. But right now, I think there's some element of that wouldn't you rather manage a team of people who had an intrinsic motivation to do the work itself and value the contributions other workers were making? Wow, that's a powerful thing. I would think any manager at any company would want to create an environment that was like that. And the challenge for me was, how do I find a way into that without ruining it, without spoiling it with all these very logical, structured ideas for how teams should work? Yeah.
So I have a question. We do a lot of this, using Yammer and Link. We record every team call. My boss moved to Italy just for a year because he can work from there. We're all remote, basically. But so a couple of questions. Time zones just kill us. There's 11 p.m. is the only 11 p.m. Seattle time is the only time our whole team can be awake. That isn't between 12 and 5 a.m. So that's one thing. The other one, as you bring in external organizations, so within Microsoft Travel, we deal with American Express, we deal with companies that will create call centers and MSIT, and dealing with all these different a little disconnect can go on for months sometimes. Something that you thought would be obvious, but it's like, oh, that wasn't in the spec. How do you get over those sort of things when you're not actually the ones building?
Okay, so the two questions. One was just about basic remote work challenge of time zones, and the second was about the little details that get lost when you're working with people who are... So the time zone question, that comes up in the book. There's a chapter called Follow the Sun. There was a moment in time where my team was at maximum evil distribution on the planet. There was no good time. We were all 8 hours apart. And that means someone has to be up at 2:30 in the morning. It was Bo, who is crazy enough. He's like, yeah, I want to try that. And it was a complete disaster for him. But the time zone thing becomes a burden for the team. If everyone wants to keep everyone engaged, you come up with ways to work around it. Ideally, you divide up tasks in a way that have logical sequences. So it can become an advantage where if you have two people who are good at working as a pair, they're taking turns. One guy is going to sleep and then wakes up the next morning. And then his partner, she gets up and the stuff shows up. Hey, the next piece has been done. So if you have good collaboration between, it never works for everybody, but you can find people to pair up that just naturally do a better job at this leapfrogging each other. Certainly in terms of design work or programming. There were no marketers at the company. There was no real product planning, so I couldn't say the same thing for those things. But as leader, that's one of the things I'm thinking about. How do I make it so that I put the burden of that challenge on the part of the team that has the best relationship to manage it? There's no universal answer for it. Absolutely not. Another advantage that they have is that everyone's remote. And so by virtue of the fact that you applied to work at the company, you had to go past I didn't have a chance to talk about this, but their hiring process is just amazingly simple and smart. There's no interview loops. You're hired by trial. This sounds radical, I know, but to get the job, you have to show you can do the work you'll do in the job. Whoa! Who thought of that? That's just madness. So there's no interview loops, there's no phone conversations, no one asks you what your strengths are, or tell us about a mistake, there's none of that. So by virtue of the fact that you got hired, it means you probably communicate well, and you're okay with the remote thing, and you are probably good at managing your time. Because these trial projects, a lot of talented people apply for them, and they can't manage their time to do it on Saturday or interleave it with their other job, so the trial fades and they peter out. So why was I mentioning the trial? So that helps answer your second question, which is by virtue of the hiring process, but mutually, it filters out people that are probably not going to fit the challenges that the way the culture is set up is going to work. Yeah, in the back.
That's a good precursor because I'm wondering how you take somebody who's never had a job before, a new college graduate, bring them into this culture and get them started. In a lot of cases, they won't have the ability or the background or the experience to work in a team, to work remotely, to communicate like that, et cetera. What proportion of the company was that and how did you deal with it?
Sure. So the question was, how do you take someone who's never worked in a crazy environment like this, which is most of the planet, or worked at all? There's a chapter in the book that talks about, it's like every 7th or 8th chapter in the book steps back and tries to answer some of these bigger questions about all the crazy stuff I experienced. So there's a chapter in the book that talks about this, and if you had to write a MBA-style cultural evaluation about who they hire and what the profiles are, what would it be like? They do hire a lot of people that are that young, and they do hire a lot of people that have never had a job before. The way they manage that, or why that isn't a complete disaster, is these are people who are craftsmen, designers, programmers, web developers. So they're people who have a tangible craft, and they're good at it. And they probably have done work where they are working independently as a web designer or web developer for clients. They've never had a real job, but they've worked with clients before. And to work with clients means they've had to juggle different skill sets. They've had to manage communication with people they don't work with all the time. That's at least while I was there, it was a high percentage of the employee base. Had never worked at a corporation, had never worked at a big company, but had worked at a web development shop, had done web development or web design work in college for their department. So they had experience with the craft. And the job is the craft. No one's hired to be a middle manager of 700 people in 6 disciplines. That's not a function. Everyone there is expected to be a craftsman of something. I had a sort of, my background is in design, user interface design. So the closest thing I had to that was that. I'm a designer. So until our team had a full-time designer, I did the UI design work. That was my craft. But almost everyone at the company has a craft, and that explains a lot of the autonomy, a lot of the trust. Everyone sees the tangible contributions that everyone else is making. There's no one whose job it is just to make a schedule, or just to send emails, or just to manage a distribution list. Yeah?
What was the largest team size that this scaled up to?
Well, now the company is about almost 200 people, the company. And there are teams that are, while I was there, the largest team was what's called the happiness team. They had some of these sort of, I thought they were sort of corporate-y, using rhetoric to cover up, like whitewashing. The happiness team was a support team. Happiness team was one of the larger teams. They probably had 12 people, 15 people. And as it got bigger, they made it divided into sub-teams, which is normally what you'd expect. What will happen when that team is 50 people, 100 people? Who knows? How much of this culture will survive once there's a little bit more hierarchy? Don't know. I think that they'll fare better than most cultures will because of how much they've diminished that from where they've started from. It's also built into the culture that leadership, my role that I had as team lead, is a role, not a job. So it's expected that those roles will change. And that happened to me. Right before I left, I stepped down as lead, and I just became a designer, which I thought was fascinating. In the history of teams, I don't know that ever happening, of the lead guy stepping down and becoming now reporting to one of the people he used to manage. But that's just built into the culture of it's more of a role than a profession. Yeah?
How did compensation work? Was it transparent, or was there any sort of weirdness around?
Compensation was weird. Not a lot of discussion about it. The upside is that there was not a lot of interest in it. Like I mentioned before, when I asked my team, how well are you doing? The main reason most people have an answer for that is they want to know if they're getting a raise or not. They want to know if they can buy the new car, the new house, or whatever. The quality of life trade is part of why people apply there in the first place. They don't have to relocate. I can't say how many, but certainly 20%, 30% of the employees of the company can't relocate, either for family reasons or for health reasons. So the fact they can have a job like this at a premier company is just a godsend on its own. And then the fact they can control their hours, how often they work, those freedoms is part of the trade. They're taking the job for those freedoms. And it tends to, at least my experience there was, that made them less interested in these concerns about, they're paid well. They're paid industry averages or above industry averages. But it's not the focus. The focus is on the work and the freedom they have to live their lives outside of work. Not everyone wants that. Some people want to get a raise every month, want to buy a bigger house, and they will find the culture probably doesn't fit that because that's just not the way people are motivated there. Yeah?
You talk about clarity and trust and how you build trust in the team. How do you build clarity and keep the crispness and the transparency?
Good question. I don't know. The question was, how do you keep clarity? You do your best. I don't know. That was a challenge for me. Great. I came up with these two objectives: clarity and trust. Right? That's it's free to use those words. It's free to walk around. I am Mr. Clarity and Trust. Look at here's my clarity ray. What? Every decision you make has to, you hope, in the eyes of the people who you're working with, help them do their job better. I don't know that I can give you a magic answer. I think that once you earn the respect from people that they think you're good at making decisions, which is what a kind of clarity, and that you're trustworthy, that you accumulate that over time, and you can then ask for more trust. And then if you fail, they're more willing to forgive you because you've built up this reputation and basis. To me, the question of clarity is a question about how do you think well, it's a much bigger question than I could answer. Yeah?
One of the things that I value about working at a company that isn't completely remote is getting to meet new people, make friends, socialize with people during my day. So two things. One, do you think that this culture attracts people that perhaps don't value that as much or are more introverted? And perhaps as a second point, do you think that maybe people that do work for WordPress either miss that aspect or find it as an advantage that they can spend some of that energy on the outside extracurricular activities?
So the question is, this gentleman is saying that for him, part of the advantage or one of the things he likes about work is that there's a social network you get from that. You get coworkers to go to lunch with or go to happy hour with. It's just built into your job and not built in here. How did that work? It's another trade-off that's, there's two things here. I think most people can guess there's going to be less of that, unless you want to drive 700 miles, every morning to go have coffee with someone. So people know that, and people who, like you, have strong feelings of that would never probably apply. Even among the people who accept the job, and I felt this when I joined too, that you don't get that for free. You don't get the social network for free. Also, being online, I showed you IRC, Skype, and the P2s, the blogs. No one's going to notice that you are depressed. No one's going to walk by your office and go, hey, Sally, like, are you okay? Like, you're acting a little different today. No one's going to do that. They don't know. So there's this layer of just basic social interaction that you don't get for free. Totally true. And there's no compensation for that. I think that I learned that I could get some of that just by, I had to be outgoing, though. You have to go into IRC and say, hey, I just showed up to work today. There's a little bit you have to do to invite people then to give you some of that back. So I got some of it. I did feel like I was on a real team and a real project. My team, the book talks about this a lot, how we built camaraderie even though we were 1,000 miles away. It can be done, but it's definitely different. And most people who I talked to who had been there for, it takes about 2 or 3 months to adjust to having a job where you don't get those things for free. You have a job, you do, but you still got to find some other people to go to coffee with. Co-working spaces is one answer, and a lot of people who work at WordPress.com use them. You guys know about co-working spaces? That's the mad. You have other people who are weird like you and took a crazy job at a crazy company, but you're in the same place, so you can talk about how crazy your companies are.
Is that like an official structure, or?
It's subsidized. At least it was.
I mean, is there like, you know, like how there's websites like Airbnb or whatever that like are for that thing? Is there like an official like, oh, workspaces for people that have strange jobs?
Yeah.
Just like, oh yeah, we're all at Starbucks. And
no, co-working spaces. It's very popular now and trendy, even in Seattle, that there are these places you rent out a desk. And so that's what I'm saying. At WordPress.com, a lot of people, I don't know, maybe 1 out of 3, that's where they'd work. Or they had a desk they could get where they could go and get that if they wanted to. It's got very common. The number of freelancers we have today, part of that remote working number I showed earlier, the number of people we have who, through their laptops, that's how they work as freelancers, writers, designers, marketers, consultants. The co-working thing is still on the rise. There's tons of spaces in Seattle that are just offices for coworkers. It's crazy. Yes?
How do they deal with a situation where a certain role isn't needed anymore, or somebody, for whatever reason, isn't able to get their job done?
So the question is, how do they deal with when a role isn't needed anymore or someone isn't doing their job? The role isn't needed anymore. Given how they've been able to hire, they hire people who are craftsmen but are versatile. These are not people who have master's degrees in anything. These are people who are independent consultants, so they tend to be jack of all trade, or T-shaped is the fancy management term, where it should really be an inverted T, where there's one skill that they're really deep in, but there's a bunch of skills they have basic proficiency in. So it's sort of like hiring a contractor for your house who's like super good at roofing, but he can probably fix just about anything. He won't be the best guy, but he can do almost anything. So most of the employees are like that. So when a project dies or goes away, there's usually some of the project that needs some of their skills. The performance thing comes up in the book, and there's definitely people who are not good performers. Any environment, once it's more than like 3 people, you're going to have people who think other people are not performing well. That's just the way that it goes. It's just human nature. I found that because of how organic even these team structures were, that the people who were not performing well were much easier to navigate around than most places I have seen. Because there's not this entrenched power structure and it's all a service that anyone can update the code to or design things for, and it's based on an open source project where people are moving stuff around all the time. If we had a situation where there was some developer who was supposed to be doing something and didn't do it, eventually we'd nag and nag and nag, and eventually one of my developers would just go and do it. The culture doesn't have a lot of turf lines, or they're certainly much softer than a traditional company would be. Yeah?
So you mentioned early on that the people on your team didn't have a metric of gauging how well they were doing their job. How did that evolve over time, and was it a metric created while you were there?
Yes! What a great question. So the question was, I mentioned that when we first started, I asked my team how good a job they were doing, and they were like, I don't know. And he asked, how did that evolve over time? So I saw that was a primary way, a primary function I could provide once I earned their trust. If they didn't trust me, who cares what my evaluation of their performance is? So I had to earn their trust first. So by the time the team was about 6 months old, it grew by a few people, I started having one-on-ones. Magical idea. One-on-ones with them where I would give them feedback on what they were doing well, what I thought they could do better. It was informal. It was done in Skype. Sometimes we use email for that because we found that they would give more dedicated time to actually having that discussion. But it evolved organically, and it was something that there was mutual interest in. They wanted that feedback. As a team, they wanted to understand how am I contributing and what else can I do to improve. Yeah, so I am out of time. So I can say this. I think I'm supposed to stay and sign books. I'd be thrilled if you bought a book so I can sign it for you. But if you had a question for me that we didn't have time for, you think about it later. My website has my contact info. You go to scottbirkin.com, go to contact, send me an email. Just mention you saw me speak today so I won't ignore you. Say, hey, yeah, I was in the audience. What about blah? I promise I will answer your question. I might not answer it today, but I promise I will answer your question if you get in touch with me. So thank you for listening, and I hope you check out the book.